Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second installment of A New Political Reality, our three-part webinar series on new risks and new opportunities for business in the evolving 2025 political landscape. Today, we're focused on helping your business navigate the 119th Congress. My name is Sarah Bonk, and I'm the founder of Business for America. A big thanks to our promotional partners who helped get the word out about today's event, the Business and Democracy Initiative, Citizen Connect, the Fulcrum, R Street, and state business executives. If your organization would like more information or to become a promotional partner for future programming, please reach out to our marketing director, Chip York, chip@bfa.us. For those joining us for the first time, Business for America is a business membership organization, a national, nonpartisan nonprofit, and we focus exclusively on how companies and business associations can help foster a healthy representative democracy, greater bipartisanship, and effective government. Our member companies come from across the country in all different sectors and sizes, from Fortune 500s to small startups. At the core of our mission is the understanding that the business community has a bottom line economic interest in how our democratic institutions function, and that this is a genuinely nonpartisan issue. We also believe that talking about the problem is not enough. And so we work with businesses to take meaningful action together. And we would love to invite your business to become a member. And you can learn more at bfa.us. So today, in session 2 of A New Political Reality, we're focused on the 119th Congress, where Business for America and our member businesses are focused on forging productive relationships with lawmakers from across the political spectrum. And as we engage on Capitol Hill, we're on the lookout for opportunities to work together, as well as obstacles to getting things done. And so before we get to our panelists, we just wanted to share a few pieces of data and some observations on the recent state and current state of Congress. First of all, something you've all heard about: approval ratings. In Gallup surveys, Americans' opinion of how Congress is handling its job have hovered around historic lows for a couple decades now, even dipping below 10%. In a 2014 survey reported in The Hill, voters felt more positively about Brussels sprouts, head lice, and root canals than Congress. But it hasn't always been this way. You can see a post 9/11 bump there in the middle of the chart when approval shot from 42% to 84% as the public rallied behind political leaders. But today we'd be thrilled to see a 42% approval rating. And even outside of that spike, it wasn't unusual to see rates in the 30 to 60% range. What would it take for Congress to earn higher approval ratings again? Another concerning trend: Congress's productivity has been low. In the 118th Congress, just 274 statutes were enacted into law, and 79 of those were commemorative. This chart shows how productivity has declined since the 100th Congress, 100th Congress being in 87, 88, thanks to our friends at AEI and from Philip's wonderful report for this great chart that shows these trends. And the trends are even more dramatic when you look farther back. You can see that the 118th Congress passed fewer laws than any of its predecessors since the US Civil War. Now, measuring the number of bills can be misleading because we rely today on omnibus, these larger packages of legislation. But when you look at the total pages of legislation enacted, the low productivity of the 118th Congress is still apparent. It was around half the pages of the 101st Congress. So how are we supposed to get solutions to our business and societal problems when Congress itself isn't doing nearly enough? Another concerning trend: evidence indicates that Congress has grown more hyperpartisan and less collaborative over time. What you're looking at here is one of my favorite charts. It's a visualization of the level of cooperation, or lack thereof, between Democratic and Republican Party members in the House of Representatives from 1949 to 1979. Democrats are blue dots, Republicans are red dots, and those gray lines that in between that create the cloud are showing where they cooperate on legislation. And so although the red and blue dots do tend to group together, it's interesting to see how they overlap, and these clouds do shape shift over the years. Now, when we look at 1981 through 2011, it's stunning how the party clusters and the inter-party cooperation nearly disappears. What the researchers found is that partisanship in the US Congress has been increasing exponentially for over 60 years with no signs of abating or reversing. And I wonder what the map of this would look like today. Now, of course, we believe it's important for different parties and individuals to hold true to their values and represent their voters. And at the same time, it's really challenging to navigate these dynamics. How can the business community help find those areas of common ground and foster bipartisan cooperation so we can get more things done? And finally, something we're going to talk about a lot today, the balance of powers. It appears to be out of whack as Congress has voluntarily ceded much of its power. Scholars will note if you go through Article 2 of the Constitution, it's actually surprising how little power the executive has been granted in the Constitution. But over the decades, our legislative branch has willingly ceded much of its power to the executive. Why? Why would they voluntarily cede any of their power? Well, it turns out there are lots of reasons. I'm sure our expert panelists will help us answer that important question. There's lots for us to think about and discuss today as we're figuring out how to navigate this new political reality. So thank you all once again for joining us today. And with that, I'll hand it off to Richard Idlen, Business for America's National Policy Director. Richard, please take it away.
Good. Thank you, Bonk, and welcome everyone. Really excited to have this conversation today and have three great panelists, all with Capitol Hill experience, to give us a better understanding of what's happening in Washington, D.C. And let me quickly introduce them. Phil Wallach is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies America's separation of powers with a focus on the relationship between Congress and the administrative state. In his latest book, published in 2023, Why Congress?, Dr. Wallach defends the centrality of Congress's role in America's constitutional system. Before joining AEI, Phil was a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institute, was later affiliated with the R Street Institute, and served as a fellow with the House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress in 2019. Nan Swift is a resident fellow in the governance program of the R Street Institute. Previously, Nan worked for the U.S. Senate Budget Committee, where she was responsible for outreach to coalition partners. And previous to that, she worked as the Director of Federal Affairs for the National Taxpayers Union. Finally, Taylor Swift, who is not related to Nan Swift. Taylor is the Director of Congressional Engagement for the Rebuild Congress Initiative. Prior to that role, Taylor was the Director of Government Capacity at the Pop Vox Foundation, and earlier in his career, Taylor worked for the U.S. House of Representatives Democratic Caucus under leader Hakeem Jeffries, where he helped to establish the House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. So thank you all so much for joining us. And in today's conversation, I thought we would really focus on four issues, and Bonk touched on a number of these, but those four are the current operational capacity and functionality of Congress, what's happening with its responsibility to fulfill Article 1 powers. Secondly, what is the rationale and thinking behind a general acquiescence to the executive branch and to President Trump, and will that last? Thirdly, what impact are these trends and developments having on the private sector? Is the business community going to be able to pursue its own particular commercial priorities? And fourthly, what opportunity is there for bipartisan collaboration on any range of issues, but particularly those that help to strengthen our institutions and safeguard our constitutional democracy? So Phil, if we could start with you and give us a sense, if you would, historically, about whether this Congress, the 119th Congress, is significantly different from maybe what it was 20 years ago under Bush II, or maybe even going back to Lyndon Baines Johnson in the 1960s. And when you think about Congress's responsibilities, many of which are identified in Article 1 of the Constitution, there's a long list, but they don't seem to be actively pursuing their responsibilities. And what does the history tell us about the possible future, if you would?
Sure. Well, thanks so much, Richard and Bonk, for including me in this. There's a lot to take in Congress's long history, right? Congress as an institution is not a constant. It's a continuously evolving creature. And it goes through periods of subordinating itself to the president. This is not something brand new in American history by any means. So if we think about Franklin Roosevelt's 100 days, uh, that was not a time of great congressional deliberation. That was a time when the White House sent over bills and Congress rushed them through into law, um, and really built up a president-centered administrative state during that time. Now, you also saw a reaction to that. Congress, especially after the 1942 midterm election, feeling that it needed to claw some power back from the Roosevelt White House. So you saw them pass the Hatch Act, preventing federal employees from participating in electoral politics. You saw them pass the Administrative Procedure Act, trying to give courts more ability to make sure agencies were not acting in an arbitrary and capricious manner. So you saw a reaction. In the 1960s, you saw a big buildup of federal spending and presidential power, especially around the Vietnam War. You then saw a reaction to that, right? The 1970s were a time of resurgence for Congress when they passed the Congressional Budget Act, the War Powers Act, when they established the Inspectors General program. And not all of those interventions were so successful in the long run, but again, you see that pattern, the presidency getting built up and then Congress feeling that it needs to claw some power back, recenter itself. So are we going to see that now in the 119th Congress? Well, it's not a great bet that we're going to see it just yet. The Republican Party that's got a hold of both the House and the Senate is unusually centered on its president. And both the House and the Senate are unusually leader-dominated bodies right now, relative to how they've been in their history. And in the House in particular, the leader of the House of Representatives is very clearly beholden for his job to the president. And so it would be a big surprise to see the House start to question a lot of what's happening in the White House right now. The Senate, it's less clear. The new majority leader, John Thune, is not beholden to the president for his job. He was not the president's choice to lead the party in the Senate. And what kind of lines he's going to draw over the next few months will be one of the big stories to watch. He decided clearly not to fight on cabinet nominations, but that's in keeping with tradition. Generally, the president's party certainly will support the president's ability to choose his own cabinet nominees. So the big question for Congress in 2025 and going forward is whether the lawmakers themselves see their institution as central to deciding big questions, or whether enough of them are basically resigned to cheerleading or bellyaching about what goes on in the executive branch. Are they going to insist on Congress being the institution to make the decisions? It's not clear. I think we've seen members of both parties in the past couple decades, especially putting sort of partisan teamsmanship above any kind of institutional patriotism. They care less about Congress's prerogatives than whether their team is getting ahead. And certainly, I think Republican lawmakers right now are very sincere in believing that a lot of what the Trump White House is doing is justified by turnabout as fair play. They feel that, however artfully Presidents Obama and Biden may have done it, that they were in fact turning the federal government into a patronage machine for Democratic interests. And they think if rigging the system in favor of Democrat interests was fair, then it's only fair that they should unrig it, blow that up, and reset it on lines favorable to their party and the interests that it represents. Now, I think we have some long run stories that we have to watch. What is going to happen to the power of the purse? That I think the Trump 47 administration is setting out a very clear confrontational line on it. So that will be one of the biggest stories when it comes to Congress's role in our system. I'll leave it there.
Great. Phil, thanks. That was really very helpful. Let me ask you just for a detail. You spoke about the leadership within the House and the Senate, and that is the expansion of the influence of the majority leader vis-a-vis committees, I suspect, is what you're speaking of.
Yeah, if you go back to Congress a half century ago, committees were the center of the action. And over time, committees have been rendered subservient to the party leaders much more clearly, including just by having the chairs owe their jobs to the leaders, in fact. So I've come to believe that having committee-centered government was much healthier in terms of letting members focus on the American people's problems and solve them, rather than thinking about how everything plays into partisan advantage or disadvantage. And certainly committees are not unimportant today. They still do some very important work, and I don't want to belittle that, but it would be better if we could recenter the committees as sort of the engine of policymaking rather than having so much run through the leadership offices.
Right. Okay. Thank you. We're going to return to those questions, build on what you had said, but let me turn to Nan for a few moments. And Nan, as an expert on the budgeting process, my first question is, what has happened to the normal process of crafting the federal budget? And what do you anticipate Congress doing in the coming weeks, given that we have a potential budget shutdown on March 14th and the importance of a reconciliation bill? And then, finally reflecting on Philip's comment about the uncertainty of whether the Congress will exert its power over the budget and the power of the purse. So how are you seeing things lining up here in the weeks to come?
Well, after reading the news every day and after Phil's comments, I kind of just want to crawl under my desk, but we'll persevere here. You asked what the budget this time around is compared to how we normally do things. Well, if there's any comfort to be had, we don't normally do anything with the budget process for more than 2 decades has been anything but normal. If we agree that normal is what was laid out in the 1974 Budget Control Act, in which Congress was supposed to pass a budget resolution, not a law, important to remember. A resolution, which is a series of suggestions that both the House and the Senate agree to in theory, and then proceed to appropriate funds, hopefully before the end of September, which is the end of the fiscal year. It's been a very long time since that happened. And over time, not only have we not finished our work in time, requiring either some kind of a continuing resolution of indeterminate length or an omnibus or a cromnibus or some combination thereof in order to keep the government open, or we don't keep the government open. That's also an option. But increasingly, the budget has become a messaging document for party priorities, often so detached from what could actually be enacted in both chambers that it's rendered something of a joke. And it's not even taken up. And instead, we do what is deeming, which is when House and Senate budget chairs declare what the top line will be for discretionary spending, and then appropriators can do their work and move ahead. It's amazing what we can just make up as we go along. But right now, we have what's called reconciliation, and it's important to remember that it does start with a budget resolution, um, but that budget doesn't have anything to do with appropriations. This again is um, a partisan priority, but in this case, not a messaging document because we're playing with fire in order to bypass the Senate's filibuster and move a package of priorities as quickly as possible. And this has become what parties do when they hold all the main levers of power.
I recall reading an article recently, Nan, about the role of the appropriators, uh, called cardinals because of their significant role in making decisions. And a number of the senators quoted in the article were expressing dismay over the process and wondering whether they had lost their importance, representing constituencies and among other concerns vis-a-vis what OMB has been pursuing in the past month. So could you comment on the role of the appropriations committees and then also how you see OMB influencing the budget process this time around?
Certainly. Yes. The appropriators used to be called cardinals, not for their bright plumage, but for their power, which is akin to those who are next in line to the Pope. They are kind of left out of the reconciliation process. And I've also heard from some individuals that appropriators are disappointed. I don't think that you need to shed too many tears for them because we do still need to pass appropriations on a regular basis. It's true. That is difficult, but it can be done. It has been done. And they still have an important role to play, both ahead of the March 14 deadline, but in the um, next year, the FY26 appropriations. And while they may see their role being subsumed by OMB, that's that's not something I love. It's important to remember that OMB is the executive branch, and as we're here talking, and as Philip explained, we have a major executive overreach situation happening. But at the same time, as a fiscal conservative, I'm not terribly sorry to see appropriators lose a little of their cachet. They still technically do hold the levers of maybe not power, but of finance when it comes to discretionary spending, which many Americans care a great deal about.
Good. Nan, let me just ask one final question and then we'll move to Taylor. And that is, what impact is this current budgeting process having, do you think, on the American economy, particularly as it affects businesses' decisions to make investment choices, to carry out plans for expansion, et cetera, because there's a great deal of uncertainty
Yes.
in this process at the moment.
I share those concerns. I think there is a great deal of uncertainty, not only as a result of the budget process, but by many of the other actions being taken right now by the new administration, from tariffs to Doge and everything in between. There's so many factors that go into how we feel about our economy and how we can plan, and a lot of those are up in the air. For business leaders, a lot of that has to do with What kind of a tax regime will we be looking at next year? What's going to happen with a lot of the tax credits that were initiated under the previous administration, and what's going to happen with expiring tax provisions to come? That's a big question. I think one of the biggest problems with reconciliation and approaching these kinds of sweeping policy changes from a partisan perspective, again, jamming the Senate, is that this doesn't bring sustainable long term policies to bear. Instead, whoever comes next, and it will be someone else, power will change hands. They will spend so much of their time, either as Phil laid out, playing tit for tat. We're trying to undo this, and we just have wild swings and a lot of wasted time. Whereas coming together to maybe come up with an imperfect but more long-term plan, I think would be better for everyone, and particularly businesses that thrive when they just know the rules and the rules are fair and well established.
Right, right. Thank you. Taylor, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the sense of morale and how congressional staff and how offices on Capitol Hill are feeling about some of this transition and significant change. And you mentioned recently you had been talking with quite a few different House offices, Republicans and Democrats. And there was, a sense of overwhelm, I think, and, scrambling to try to keep up with different executive orders, the enhanced role of DOGE, the enhanced role of OMB, and seemingly somewhat of a disinterest on the part of the White House in actually building relationships with many House and Senate offices. So give us a sense, if you would, about how people are feeling working under this kind of stress on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Richard, and it's great to see everybody. I promise my name is real. I get jokes all the time, but I just shake it off. So I just want to say quickly before I get into this, what I'm going to say is like for my personal capacity and does not reflect any of my work at RCI. So just wanted to add that little piece off the top. But you mentioned morale, and I kind of want to look at it from a different perspective. The reason why folks, from what I've been hearing over the past 6 to 8 weeks, feel overwhelmed and exhausted actually isn't that unique. It's not that new. It's just a different type of exhaustion. And that's because for about 30 years, congressional capacity has just not kept up with the consequential meeting of the moment that Congress needs to have. And what I mean by that is basically since the 1990s, since about 1996, committee funding, personal office funding, and funding for Congress more broadly has just not kept up with inflation and non-discretionary, non-defense spending. And so since those days, committee funding is roughly about 65% what it was if you adjust for inflation. Same with personal office funding. This includes committee and personal office staff salaries. So there was a big push right after the attack on the Capitol during COVID to actually increase funding for staff. There was a huge push, internal and external, to do this from civil society and people on the Hill, and it passed. It was a 21% increase. It was the largest single year increase in the history of Congress. But even with that increase, they were still a decade behind adjusting for inflation. They are still around fiscal year 2014 numbers. So part of the exhaustion is that the institution actually isn't giving itself the resources or the expertise from a technology perspective, from a resource perspective, from a relationship building perspective, to actually have parameters to get things done, whether it's through partisanship, through your party priorities, or through bipartisanship. And, Phil and Nan said this earlier, it is very leadership driven. The past 30 years have kind of centralized a lot of the leadership power and the structures. That is mainly due to political incentives and trying to be more legislatively efficient for your party. But a casualty of that can be those relationships, that trust, especially with folks on the other side of the aisle, or even within your own party. And traditionally, when staffers are feeling overwhelmed or they need help, they go to their legislative support agencies like GAO, the Government Accountability Office, or CRS, the Congressional Research Service. These are in-house legislative branch experts. GAO, for example, actually every dollar that Congress invests in GAO returns about $111 in waste, fraud, and abuse. So it is an extremely productive agency. But again, going back to funding, they aren't funded nearly as much as they should be if we adjust for inflation. They are roughly 87% of what they were in the mid-90s. So they're just leaving money on the table. So when we talk about folks being overwhelmed, folks not having quality relationships with people in the agencies, that might be true for the administration right now. They definitely have priorities to do things full speed ahead and, quite frankly, maybe leave Congress behind. But it's also been Congress not giving themselves the resources and building up that expertise and building up those relationships for generations that is leading to these approval ratings and this output that we have been seeing, and that your colleague kind of outlined at the beginning of this discussion. The reason why could be political, but then also it is a design flaw. The legislative branch appropriations bill, which funds how Congress funds itself, is the smallest subcommittee. It is often the subcommittee that members who are on the Appropriations Committee do not want to be on because it's the smallest one. And if you're voting for a bill to strengthen Congress or to fund Congress more, the optics of voting yes on that are extremely difficult. If you are in a very close election or you are being primaried by someone in your party, that is just free ad campaigns for everyone to be like, look, they're not helping you, the American people. They're not helping you in your district. They're actually just funding their salaries. They're funding the institution. They're funding the DC swamp. And so the optics to actually boost legislative branch capacity is very, very difficult. And we've been seeing that for the past 30 years. And so just wanted to mention all of that as like a foundation of why people are exhausted in the current moment, but it's also something that has been going on for a long time.
Right, right. Thank you for that overview. And given all those factors, Taylor, tell us a bit about the work that the Select Committee on Modernization of Congress succeeded in accomplishing over the past 3-4 years. Maybe just remind people what the purpose of that Select Committee was, and then what you anticipate, if anything, happening to upgrade Congress's capacity this year and in 2026.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Like you said off the top, I'm a little biased because I helped create the committee when I worked for then Caucus Chairman Hakeem Jeffries. But that Select Committee actually isn't new. There have been multiple iterations over Congress's history. The Joint Committee on the Organization of Congress in 1946, there was another one in 1970, and then, of course, one in 1991. The important thing about those is, like I said, they were joint committees. They were between both chambers of Congress. The one that the House set up is only for that particular chamber. So over the past 5 years, we've actually seen all of these operational inroads, and especially around technology. I remember around a decade ago, when I was an intern on the House side, I spent 70% of my time gathering physical co-sponsorships for bills, like running around office to office. That is all electronic now. There are committee repositories with documents. I could go on a whole preamble about how there needs to be better technology, and Congress continually needs to be investing as much as the private sector is in things like AI and efficiency to make their jobs easier, especially as capacity is so thin. But the Select Committee is great because, first of all, it is extremely bipartisan. The Select Committee was a 7-7 membership, R&D. 95% of their 202 recommendations that were created from the Select Committee were passed unanimously bipartisan. I can't name anything in Congress that has had that kind of bipartisanship in the past 25 years. And it's because when members actually had the time and the resources to think critically about these problems facing the House and facing the institution, they knew that it wasn't actually a partisan issue and that it would help everybody involved, including constituents. And there have been a ton of great things, especially around like accessibility for constituents on campus, website accessibility, better tools for oversight, helping push for unimplemented GAO recommendations, which can save billions of taxpayer dollars over years. So they really covered a ton of work that not only affected staff and members, but then also did some critical work to invest to have better resources for constituent engagement and outreach.
Great, great. And for those of you who are interested in learning more about these efforts to modernize Congress, Rebuild Congress Initiative is a great resource. And on the Business for America website, there's also some material that you can find under our policy tab. And we expect to be involved again this year in supporting those reform efforts. Phil, let me go back to you for a moment. And you spoke about the centrality of Congress's role in as a co-equal branch of government. And if you think to the challenges that lie ahead, and maybe some of the possible growing pressure and business pressure on Congress to reassert its authority, are there particular areas where we might look for Congress to do that? For instance, maybe increasing its investigatory oversight capacity, challenging DOJ's decision-making process, looking at national emergencies, declaration of national emergencies, maintaining the independence of various federal agencies that are supposed to not be working at the discretion of the president. So what do any of those resonate with you, or should we be looking elsewhere for possible reassertion of congressional authority?
There have been little bits of action on all of those fronts that you just mentioned. And if I'm being honest, though, I don't imagine those getting a lot of traction in 2025. I'll go back to my assertion and some of what Nan talked about. I think the fights over the power of the purse are the ones most likely to sort of come to a head and force Congress to make up its mind. Are they going to permanently belittle themselves in some way by basically saying the president can ignore the appropriations laws we pass, the president can ignore basically the terms of the deals that we strike are just subject to being rejiggered by the president as he sees fit later. Like that would be a really bad precedent for Congress in general. It would sort of suggest that a lot of what goes on in Capitol Hill is just play acting, and that the real decisions of governments are all going to be made, down at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. And I do think that there's going to be some members on the Republican side who will balk at that. I don't think they're going to be eager to go along with that. I don't know how much that's going to be also true for some of the sort of questions of how the federal workforce is put together. There are a lot of laws on that. Right now, the administration is signaling pretty clearly that since they believe the president is the head of the executive branch, he doesn't have to worry too much about some of those laws. I think the rhetoric probably is more aggressive than some of the actions right now, but they are. I do think the administration is being quite confrontational. So we're going to have to see whether members decide that those are fights worth picking. That again, the laws that Congress has passed to structure the federal employment really are supposed to be the last word. And a lot of this will also get decided in the judiciary, right? That's going to happen a little more slowly. It takes time for things to filter through courts, but it's going to be interesting to see how much judges are, including Trump-appointed judges, are willing to say, sorry, you're moving a little too fast or too recklessly in regard to these statutes that are on the book. If you want to change things, you're going to have to actually change the statutes. So I think that has a lot to do with this question that Nan again brought up about stability of policy. Can we work through problems and reach lasting solutions? Like, the key to that is big bipartisan coalitions. That's in fact, the normal way of deciding big questions. As much as we're in a partisan era, we still can decide a lot through big bipartisan coalitions. Are we still going to be able to do that in spending bills, in the National Defense Authorization Act? That's been the norm even in this hyper-partisan time, or are we sort of entering into a new time where the president doesn't want anything to do with the minority party? If that's the case, then I think we would be fully justified in expecting, whiplash next time control of the White House changes.
Good. Thank you. Nan, I presume you'd like to comment on that, but first, before you do, let me just remind the audience, that your time in the Senate Budget Committee probably brought you into contact with a lot of business interests and companies who had particular priorities they wanted addressed in the process. So if you can maybe educate us a little bit about how companies and business interests, trade associations participate in the budget making process, and then secondly, reflect upon what Phil just suggested, as far as this challenge that Congress has before itself to reassert its influence over the power of the purse.
I am so glad that you asked that, because that gives me the chance to talk about one of my favorite experiences. I did intersect with a lot of businesses, but even colleges and universities, not to mention nonpartisan groups with different ideological priorities, and associations that represented businesses, large, small, you name it. But I had gotten to know a lot of those same groups who are outside some of the the center right politicos that I usually had worked with, even before I got on the Senate Budget Committee, through an organization called Convergence. And this was just a little bit before the ModCom work that Taylor and Phil and others did. Convergence brought together every conceivable stakeholder in the budget process that you can imagine. Started by polling them for what their priorities were, and then asking them, if you share concerns about the fact that Congress doesn't really budget, then let's talk and let's form a working group. And they took a lot of time, as both Phil and Taylor have both mentioned. Time is so critical to formulating these good decisions and grand deals. And that was something that I saw play out there over like a 2-year process that involved building trust with one another and being willing and open to share their thoughts in an atmosphere of friendliness and professionalism. And they developed some really good recommendations. I was able to then take that knowledge and contacts when I went to the Senate Budget Committee, where Senator Enzi and then ranking member, no, sorry, he wasn't the ranking member at the time. He later became chair, but Senator Whitehouse also cared a lot about budget process reform, and the convergence process and their recommendations became part of it. The biggest concern to the associations and businesses that I talked to was regular budgeting and appropriations. They need it to happen. They needed it to be predictable. For instance, one person I worked with who represented some colleges and universities who do a lot of research, they're like, we don't, if we don't know what's going to happen, then suddenly, the doors in the lab are locked. And what happens to all those, mice with ears on their back um, for for whatever thing we're working on, and it can also imperil decades and decades of research and the resources that went into that if they just don't know. And you know what? If the answer is cuts, then they'll adjust. If the answer is more, then they'll adjust that way. They just have to know what is happening. And that's a massive problem that we're actually seeing unfold right now with the actions that Doge is taking. I'm hearing from people who literally are my next door neighbors in this condo building. And it's not even a nice or good condo building, but my next door neighbor, who's a contractor, who her bosses cannot communicate with her. So she doesn't know either way what's happening. She just needs to know. Everyone will adjust based on decisions that are made, but when it's not clear, and when it's not clear by whose authority you can do what, then everyone is just kind of stuck. And that's where businesses are. And that's why so many came to us urging us to make process reforms that would help Congress pass better budgets and stick to them regardless of the contents, so that there's a little more predictability and stability in everyone's lives.
Right. Yeah. Taylor, I want to pick up on what Nan just said, and I heard a story earlier this week from a colleague in Pennsylvania explaining that an EPA grant that was supposed to have cleaned up a river had been yanked without any explanation, and the work had just stopped. My colleague brought a number of folks together who then appealed to Senator McCormick, the new Republican senator, who then apparently went to the White House and explained that the withdrawal of those funds was creating economic havoc and an environmental problem in that community. So based on what Nan just said about the importance of stability and the ability of companies and civil society and people just to plan, what do you see as the process going forward? Is this going to be very highly decentralized? People will go to their member of Congress, express their concern. Businesses will go to a committee chair and indicate that the process isn't working? Or is there a more thoughtful, rational approach here that particularly businesses could engage in?
Well, that's a lot to unpack, and there's a lot of different pieces of that in the process itself. There's the actual appropriations process, which, of the past 60 years, Congress has passed their budgets on time 3 times. So it's notoriously late in the cycle every single year. The process is very difficult. Nan and Phil also outlined how it's very leadership driven. We don't get those 302B top line numbers until very late in the game, which forces people to rush through the process. And then we oftentimes get Christmas votes or, end of year votes, end of session votes. And then things get stuck in at the last minute, which then can be perceived as, corruption or, just additional things that the social media, chattering crowd like to take and pull out. There's those issues, but then there's also issues around transparency of implementation. And so for about half a decade, Congress got rid of what is called earmarks. And actually, one of the biggest recommendations that came to fruition from the Select Committee on the House side was kind of reinstituting what are called community project funds. And they're basically earmarks. Airdrops are also something that happens. They're earmarks when they go to conference together. So when the bills are already written and they're kind of, the House and the Senate are deciding on what to add, you can add things there as well. But that power of the purse piece for a long time, for about half a decade here recently, up until about 2020, that was gone, and so that was something the executive branch could do. But now we're seeing the administration completely usurp Congress and do, like our other panelists have said, kind of just the will of what the administration is deeming in their best interest as the executive. And the administration and Elon Musk and Vivek have actually been laying breadcrumbs for months now, saying that the administration potentially could challenge the Impoundment Act of 1974. And that is going to be a humongous discussion for this year. Up until 1974, the executive branch actually had control over how Congress could give money to agencies and then could cut off that funding to agencies. After Nixon was impeached, Congress passed this law to say that, hey, we should have this power. This should be part of our Article I responsibilities. And it seems that the administration is going to want to challenge that at the Supreme Court level this year or next year. So that is definitely something that Congress, members of civil society, and businesses are going to have to watch quite carefully. But again, I really want to stress this, and Nan, told a great story about this. Congress's appropriations process is broken. And a lot of what the administration thinks, like a lot of folks on this call, myself included, like it is very scary because they are breaking things, they are doing things that haven't been done before, and they're doing it at such an intense pace. Oftentimes people that are unelected are going into these buildings and taking a lot of this information too, which is a whole separate conversation. But on its level, the administration feels that they have this mandate because Congress is too slow and they have such a low approval rating and they can't get anything done, and there hasn't been bipartisanship. And since this is the second time he's won, and this time he won the popular vote, there is a feeling that we are doing this because government is broken and we have to fix it the way that we think. Now, the way we think is right is completely up for debate for everyone, right? Their perspective is completely different than my own and everybody on this panel, but that's what they're doing. And so if you're a member of Congress, especially if you're a frontline member, you do have power here, because we are actually, especially on the House side, this is the closest margin we've seen in 100 years. It's an extremely close House, which provides leverage to a lot of political factions to either hold things up and demand things to be added, or the administration to respond to things. I don't know the political calculus right now for Democrats to shut down the government, because they really don't like to do those things. We could see something like a partial government shutdown where like things like DOD get shut down. But it's very, very interesting because of these slim majorities. You could see factions pop up where the Freedom Caucus works with the progressive, or moderate Dems work with moderate Rs. Like there are a lot of things out there, but the fact of the matter remains, this process right now, and has been for a while, very leadership driven, which leaves rank and file members in the dark, which is how you're getting stories, Richard, like you were just saying, of like members of Congress feel helpless because they've already appropriated this money, but the executive branch is doing something, but leadership doesn't have the incentive to help them at a congressional institution perspective. So it's a very, very difficult situation for everybody involved. And it could, quite frankly, get worse.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Phil, let me ask you a question that was posed by Elizabeth Doty from Third Side Strategies, and that is recourse in exploring what DOGE's scope is. DOGE is a temporary contracted organization, right, operating under the U.S. Digital Service. And is it possible, or do you see it likely, as Senator Thune calling for a hearing to bring, encourage DOGE to come in, officials, and explain the process and some of their strategy to members of the Senate in particular, if the House is not going to do that? Might that happen in the Senate?
I have to say that I'm myself spending some amount of time trying to figure out what DOGE is, and it's really not easy. Like you can read the lawsuits of people challenging its legality and the sort of early briefs that are being filed to try to get a little bit of a sense, but you know, Elon Musk is sort of, he's a special government employee, which is a strange sort of status, but he is not carrying out any of these actions himself. It's not clear, you know, there are people who are kind of branded as Doge, who are political appointees in various different agencies. They're not working for the former digital service. They're kind of spread out throughout government. So to me, Doge is kind of a hard thing to pin down right now. I do think a lot of it just comes down not to what Doge is allowed to do, but just what the president is allowed to do and whether the president is ultimately complying with the law. So I think, you know, Doge, if you want to be charitable about it, is shaking up the way of doing business for a lot of agencies right now. There's potential for good in that, for sure. So, you know, I do think if you want to think about how to make changes stick, Doge can identify deficiencies and go over to Congress and say, here's a way that we can fix the law that's broken right now. I think they'd find a lot of lawmakers very receptive. Lawmakers want to participate in this energetic thing that's happening. But if they instead just sort of say, we're doing the president's work, get out of our way, and their attitude is very standoffish with Congress, I think Congress may not take kindly to that. We'll have to see.
Right, right, which may prompt some type of response that might not have been the case if Congress had been part of the decision-making process. We have just 2 minutes, and so I think we'll leave it there. But before you all go, wanted to thank Nan and Taylor and Phil so much for your insights. We really appreciated it. Lots of things for business people to be thinking about, you know, including the process, how they can participate. I think Nan gave us a great example. Taylor made it very clear that many offices, congressional offices, rely on the business community to inform them about how what priorities are. And Phil, I think, described very accurately some of the challenges that the two bodies are facing as far as reasserting their authority. In a sense, we're going to continue this conversation, particularly about Doge's role in our next webinar, which is on March 13th. It's the third in the series on a new political reality. And so we're going to dig in to the details about how Doge is operating, its impacts on the business community, and what we might expect in the coming weeks and months. So again, if any of you listening have questions, please contact us at bfa.us. That's our website. And again, Taylor, Nan, and Phil, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And we'll be in touch with you all soon. Have a good afternoon, everyone.